evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let me just give you a quick update on what has been happening in APEC. You know, as Michael indicated, the ministers issued their statement on the 5th of May, and what happened last night, or on the 28th of May, was the first virtual meeting of the senior officials to take forward the instructions of the ministers. What was important, what came through, was the need for a coordinated approach to this to the pandemic, to especially focusing on recovery. The balance between lives and livelihoods surfaced in the discussion on the 28th, and clearly there is will on the part of all the APEC member economies to move forward to ensure that we all come out of this together. We realize that it will not be overnight, that while we need swift action, we also realize that we need to work hard and harder to ensure that we get out of this pandemic in a better shape than we are in now. Swift action is important, coordinated action is important, and the discussion on the 28th also focused on how the region can make best use of the digital economy. You know, the aspects of improving the digital infrastructure. How do we encourage innovative ways to deal with pandemics as they arise, dealing with uncertainties that may surface from time to time. So what will happen going forward is there will be this conversation to see how we can have this coordinated approach. Plus, the Malaysian team, that is Malaysia as the host of APEC this year, will be looking at bringing together the ministers for a deeper conversation around what we can do going forward as a region. So there are plans in place. Malaysia shared with us the work plan for the year. Clearly, work has not stopped at all despite the pandemic. We are carrying on. The working groups are meeting. We had the tourism working group meet virtually to discuss ways that we can that we can look at reviving the sector, how we can improve the lives of those involved in the tourism sector. So there's a lot of work that's still going on, and we will hear more as Malaysia and the rest of the economies put together the plans going forward. So I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions that you may have and pass it on to Michael or Dr. Dennis.
Right, thank you. Let me just put on my PowerPoint. Right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So as Michael said, I will spend probably about 10 to 15 minutes to share with you our recent APEC Regional Trends Analysis Report, which was released yesterday. And it gives you a pretty good snapshot of where we stand right now in terms of the economic situation. And we do provide some economic outlook looking at the forecast numbers for GDP growth over the next 1 year. So let me just move on to the next slide. So you can see from here that even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the region itself was already slowing down through concerns of economic and investment uncertainties. We had increase in trade tensions, as well as a rise in trade restrictive measures. We've seen that overall the region seen a drop in its GDP growth to about 3.6% in 2019 compared to 4.2% in 2018. So you can see that almost all the individual APEC economies have reported slower growth in 2019. And again, that's also reflected in trade performance. You can see here basically that in 2019, pretty lethargic or contractions in both imports and export growth. You can see from this chart here that both in the value of exports and imports, a contraction of minus 1.9% for exports and and minus 2.9% in terms of imports. And that sort of coincided with the increase in trade restrictive measures, particularly starting from the second half of 2017. And you can see here over that period, since the last 2 years, that the number of trade restrictive measures have outnumbered trade facilitative measures, as you see over the last 2 to 3 years. Now, besides the trade restrictive measures, there's also been, because of the pandemic as well, we've also seen an increase in different types of trade measures to address the pandemic. That includes temporary export bans on certain types of medical equipment, PPE, as they say, or there's also been relaxations of tariffs, reductions of tariffs, and also duties on certain types of medicine, food products, all related to try to address the pandemic, which, as we all know, started in the beginning of this year. And we can see in terms of the trade in medical goods in the region, it is quite substantial. The global trade itself in medical goods is about close to $1 trillion US. In the APEC economies itself, close to 41% of those medical goods contributes 41% of global import values, and for global export values, they are close to 30%. There's been some discussions right now within APEC economies to see what can be done to further reduce tariffs and different types of measures to facilitate greater flows of different types of medical goods, to particularly in the short term, to try to address this pandemic. These are some of the recent numbers on global FDI flows and also Greenfield investments. I think perhaps more worrying, if you look at the 2019 numbers, is that there's close to a 22% decline in Greenfield investments, and that's quite worrying because Greenfield investments, as many of you know, is basically foreign direct investments from the ground up. So they tend to be a bit of a monitor or indicator of the long-term prospects in the region. So I think this is perhaps one of the worrying signs. I think we have seen a number of international organizations and others looking at particularly this year being a pretty bad year in terms of economic performance. We've seen the IMF has just recently come up with their global forecast, revised downwards something like minus 3% for this year, with a recovery in 2021 of 5.8%. Well, in APEC itself, we're looking at a contraction of about 2.7% in regional GDP growth, and with a recovery on 6.3% in 2021. This, of course, assumes that right now that the pandemic would be effectively contained within the first half of this year. And there's also assumptions that we don't see a significant second wave of this pandemic. But gosh, we have to wait and see whether there'll be new developments related to the pandemic. Now, of course, if the situation gets worse, of course, we'll see the IMF as well as us, as well as other international organizations revising their forecasts downwards. We've also seen WTO looking at this year a drop in world trade growth, ranging from 13 to 30+%. Global FDI flows forecast by UNCTAD as well for this year, pretty significant drop to 30 to 40%, pretty much reflecting this the economic slowdown that's been affected by this pandemic. So what's APEC doing about it? So we've seen across the various APEC economies implementations of both fiscal as well as monetary policies to try to address this. Different types of fiscal packages have been implemented over the last couple of months to address issues related to healthcare systems, strengthening healthcare capacity, providing more hospital beds, different types of medical equipment, supporting health workers, more directly also direct financial assistance and relief packages for households and workers, and for small businesses which have been severely affected by the pandemic. We've seen different economies looking at wage subsidies, tax deferrals, and also looking at funds to support micro, small, medium enterprises. Within the region itself, there are some discussions in looking at the post-pandemic world. looking at ways to cooperate among APEC economies, particularly in looking at developing a regional pandemic planning and policy toolkit, information sharing of best practices, and looking at what can be done in terms of closer monitoring and surveillance, particularly in the healthcare sector, that would help to avoid a significant impact from future pandemics that may occur. Now, I think I won't, for the interest of time, I won't go too much in detail. We do have a special chapter for this report that looks at the circular economy. And if some of you are not aware, currently we have pretty much a linear model in terms of how we deal with raw materials. It moves basically leading up to residual waste. And the circular economy model itself looks at different types of ways to minimize waste and to maximize resources. And if you take a look at that special chapter as well, there's been some economies are beginning to take a circular economy approach to addressing the pandemic as well, looking at recycled materials and raw materials that can be used to make whether it's surgical masks or PPE or different types of medical equipment. So I think I'll stop here and welcome questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Santa Maria and Dr. Hew. A question from Takashi Nakano. What could APEC do for the recovery of the tourism sector? Shall it make a rule for the movement of people or establish a special fund of some sort?
Yeah. All right, thank you for the question. As I said earlier, the tourism working group was in fact the first to meet virtually from all the various APEC working groups. They were the first to meet virtually, and they discussed this. And it will take it will take time before you have the confidence again. People have confidence and trust in traveling, even if the situation gets better. So, topmost will be health risk, and you will see travel restrictions, stringent checks and around the airports and all those. So there will be those restrictions, but they will be mainly to ensure health and safety of the travelers, of course. Now we have in place the APEC business travel card. So foremost also it's to ensure that the business travelers are facilitated, right? So there is talk of creating bubbles, travel bubbles, but to have travel bubbles, you need to firstly ensure that there is mutual recognition of safety procedures, for example. So those things have to be put in place. There must be trust in the bilateral systems where the bubbles are created. So these are some things that are being discussed. You already see it happening between Australia and New Zealand, for example. Singapore is thinking of joining the Australia-New Zealand bubble. So these things are evolving, but more importantly, I think it's about streamlining processes, procedures to build trust in the system, so that travelers, business travelers feel assured of their safety, of their health when they embark on those travels again.
Could I add a few statistics as well? I mean, in terms of the tourism sector, it's been severely impacted by the pandemic. In terms of job losses globally, we're looking at something like 50 million job losses, of which 60% of those jobs are in the Asia region. In the APEC region itself, the tourism and hospitality sector contributes something like close to 3% of GDP, as well as 3.8% of employment. So it's quite a significant impact. So as what Dr. Rebecca said, that as the economies recover, as the pandemic abates, we'll be slowly moving back to some greater travel by businessmen, by tourists, but it will be something that will take some time. Yeah.
Hey, we have a question from the Straits Times senior correspondent, Obias Subani. Obias, would you be able to unmute your mic and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
A question from Straits Times correspondent. We can hear you.
My first question is about supply chains. There has been even in 2019, there was some issues about supply chains. And now, given the COVID-19 outbreak, that has been reinforced. Was there any discussion today about the supply chains and what role APEC can play in solving the situation, creating more durable, more diverse, more robust supply chains? My other question is, I think you have already answered that. That was on essential travel, and what exactly the travel bubbles would mean that you just mentioned, or are there other plans to facilitate essential travel? And the third question is about the November meeting in Kuala Lumpur. Is that still on? Would it still take place?
Yeah. Dennis, shall I just quickly just wrap up the tourism, just to add on the tourism question. What the tourism working group also talked through was the creation of a more effective information sharing mechanism, so they keep each other updated, so that then you start to build this trust. They also look at measures for recovery and reform to mitigate the impact on the industry. So like I said, these conversations are ongoing because the situation is evolving, and definitely the APEC members are working very hard to ensure that we come back, and we come back stronger. We may not come back in the full force that we that we were used to, but definitely recovery plans are on the cards. On supply chains, Dennis, do you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, we all know that there have been significant supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. It's still ongoing. We still have disruptions in different types of, particularly in the manufacturing sector. There's been some discussions looking at supply chain resilience, what can be done to, particularly we're looking at post-pandemic, what can be done to reduce some of these risks related to disruptions. That includes, I mean, it's quite specialized, but looking at issues like supply chain mapping, trying to map out suppliers all the way, first tier, second tier suppliers, to ensure that there are alternatives, looking at inventory capacity to ensure that it doesn't dry up during periods like this, and other sorts of measures. So that's ongoing discussions now, looking at supply chain resilience. Now, APEC itself has been doing a fair amount of work on global value chains and supply chains over the years. So it's a question of relooking at some of the work, updating some of the work, that the measures and recommendations have been put in place, and essentially prioritize them within the context of this pandemic.
Yeah, on the question of November, well, like that depends on the host, how they will structure it, and what happens in the next few months, how the situation develops. But for sure, Malaysia as hosts will have planned to have a ministers meeting sometime at the end of June. So that's at least on the cards, that we know. And from there, I suppose they will be able to advise us on the November situation.
Okay, we have another question for you, Dr. Santa Maria, from Shanti Shamadasani. A question about the role that APEC could play in healthcare and affordable vaccines, and how that relate within the global supply chain. An additional follow-up to that would be about the China, US, India geopolitics and potential tensions, and how that plays a role in the APEC process.
Yeah, the first question on the medical devices, is that what it was? Again, Michael? Didn't get it very clearly.
That's right. What role APEC would play in healthcare, affordable vaccines within the global supply chain? Well,
the APEC is first and foremost an economic forum, and we work with the relevant organizations. APEC has the health working group, and they work very closely with their counterparts, whether it's the international counterparts, whether it's the WHO or the other relevant organizations, Ray Crescent, et cetera, et cetera. So the work that we do is really in the context of collaborating with the other international organizations. We are not a scientific body as such, so therefore we depend and collaborate with and take advice from the experts in the field.
Can I just add on healthcare as well? Right now, the APEC average, if you look at healthcare capacity, it's about 4.1 hospital beds, 1.9 doctors, and 3.9 nurses for every 1,000 people. So there's still a lot of work to be done in increasing healthcare capacity. The average percentage APEC economy spend per percentage of GDP on the healthcare sector is about just below 5%. So there's still a fair amount of work that can be done. As Dr. Rebecca mentioned, the Health Working Group do discuss many of these issues. And I think one of the things that they may consider, as I mentioned in my presentation, is some sort of pandemic preparedness policy toolkit, which there we can have discussions on vaccines and other types of information sharing.
Yeah, and just to add also, APEC has a supply chain toolkit to ensure the security of the medical devices. So that was developed subsequent to SARS, and it is still relevant. And what the working group is doing now is also relooking that, reviewing that to ensure that it can be expanded and help in building capacity along the supply chain for medical devices. On the geopolitics question, again, you know, the APEC is a forum that facilitates conversations. It is non-binding, unlike the WTO or ASEAN. So we APEC then can play that role in facilitating conversations around some of the more challenging issues. But generally, our focus is on economics. And yes, we understand that sometimes, quite often actually, geopolitics gets in the way of economics. But what is important is that we have a platform for those kinds of conversations to take place in a very safe environment.
Thank you, Dr. Hew and Dr. Santa Maria. Another question about regional trade agreements. What positive and negative inputs do you see for the post-COVID-19 Asia-Pacific trade policy and the access of treaties like the USMCA, Pacific Alliance, CPTPP, and others? This is coming from Francisco Valencia from Mexico.
You know, trade agreements are very important for trade policy makers. You know, we ensure predictability, transparency in the rules that we engage in. Yes, you know, and also we build on the resilience of supply chains through the trade agreements, right? The important thing to remember is that trade agreements are not are documents that are alive. You know, there is a review mechanism in all the trade agreements. So going forward, these trade agreements will have to, as we engage in those trade agreements, we have to learn from how things are evolving, how supply chains get disrupted during pandemics and disruptions that we didn't anticipate. So I believe that going forward, trade agreements, in the review process of those trade agreements, there will have to be a risk management element embedded in it, so that you have that preparedness in the face of these pandemics, in the face of disruptions, how members or parties to that agreement can manage those situations in those smaller groups, the trade agreement, the parties within the trade agreements. So whether it's the CPTPP, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's ASEAN RCEP that's being negotiated, I think it's important that going forward, the element of risk management is included in the trade agreements.
Can I just add that regional trade agreements are essentially an alliance of like-minded trading partners. And so I think what may happen right now is to reprioritize, perhaps refocus, looking at the trade agreements, looking at issues like keeping supply chains open. We talked about the disruptions earlier. Maybe moving a bit more forward, looking at trade facilitation, what can be done to make it easier for goods to move across borders, addressing behind the borders. So these are some of the things that can be discussed and perhaps refocused, I think, with its context in mind.
Yeah, and I think also the trade agreements will need to have a stronger element of the digital economy in it, a stronger element on mutual recognition agreements, so that you, even if we are like-minded economies that have come together, that there is still that continuous need to build trust in the systems that we have put in place.
Okay. Dr. Hew, we have a question from APEC. Will the economy rebound within a year, or will it take several years? To what extent will the recovery be variable across APEC economies? And can you elaborate on the general shape and duration that you believe the recovery will take? Is it V-shaped or U-shaped or even square root shaped?
Right. I think a lot of economists are still trying to work that out. I mean, surely it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. That's what we saw, particularly if you look at, you go way back to the 1997, 98 Asian financial crisis. There was a V-shaped recovery, but this is not going to happen. And this is a twin crisis. I mean, it's both a public health crisis as well as an economic crisis. Our forecast numbers, like the IMF, is essentially looking at kind of a U-shaped recovery. And these are, again, based on certain assumptions that this pandemic will be contained, particularly within the first half of this year. So that's why you're seeing quite strong economic numbers in terms of recovery numbers in 2021. But like I said, I think we have to wait and see for future developments to see whether how this pandemic will play out. If there's a vaccine that will be coming out soon, within the next 6 months to a year, then certainly we'll see that strong recovery. But if not, or we see a second wave of that pandemic coming into the second half of this year, then very certainly every one of us would have to revise our forecast downwards.
I'd like to draw the briefing to an end. The APEC regional trends analysis can now be found online at apec.org. Also, you can find 2 infographics associated with the report that help visualize some of the data. One is focused on regional economic indicators in view of COVID-19, and the other on pivoting to a circular economy. We encourage you to follow us on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. And for more information or to request an interview, please send a note to media@apec.org. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Please